I do know that, God brings people into our lives along the way. We didn't know it at the time, but when Mark came home from treatment and we were handed our appointments with the Graves in their place, which was about 20 minutes from our home, we had no idea of the impact that would have on our lives. And I do know today, looking back at what we got through that whole system, Virginia, through Maureen and Tom to us, was actually very God ordained. And I do believe that He had a plan for our life.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and we're here today with our regular host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, good to see you again.
It's good to be here.
And we are pleased to have with us today the Director of Faithful and True, Debbie Laaser. Debbie, it's always a pleasure for Greg and me to have you on the podcast with us. How are you today?
I'm doing well. It's always good to be here talking about things, and Greg and I can talk about anything at any time. I think we're just used to letting it go,
Well,
so.
we like having you both on because you're world-class talkers. So today we're going to entertain our viewers and listeners by talking about the legacy of Faithful and True.
Right. And specifically, what we're going to be talking about today is the therapeutic legacy of Faithful and True. Just like we can have a genetic heritage or an ethnic heritage, for those of us in the field and people who have been in their own journey of recovery, there is a legacy that informs the therapy that they're experiencing. And so today we're going to be talking about the Faithful and True therapeutic legacy, what we have inherited and what we are also trying to pass on. And so, Deb, we're glad that you are here to tell the story of how the perspective and the direction of Faithful and True began.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I know we've talked about this at some point a little bit with Mark's passing, and yet in the last couple of weeks, I received a notification that our dear therapist, Maureen Graves, who worked with both Mark and myself for over 35 years of our recovery, has passed away. And it really led me to doing a lot of thinking and, of course, grieving and that long relationship of all that we learned in her presence, and at times along with her husband, Tom Graves, as well, for Mark. It was a wonderful legacy, as I say, that she brought to us. And the more I got thinking about that, what's true is Maureen and Tom's legacy goes back even further to
Mhm.
Virginia Satir. And so when I think about our multi-generational legacy, I wanted everyone who's working with us now, and maybe you as the public or whoever's listening to this podcast would have some interest also in knowing that this isn't really the Mark and Deb show at Faithful and True. We have a lot of things I suppose we've added along the way to things we've learned. And foundationally, there's some really beautiful things that came out of that long ago legacy of Virginia Satir's. So I
Mhm.
wanted to share some of that with everyone today.
And I know I've heard you and Mark both say that part of the significance of Virginia Satir was she really was one of the first, or maybe the first, that began to understand the significance of a family as a system. And kind of the idea that if you're working with an individual, you're actually working with their history, with their story, and kind of the dynamics of their family and their heritage.
Yes, that's exactly true, Greg. And I would say, I believe she was the first to really focus on a family system model when she worked with clients. And when you think about it, I mean, it was a great thing that she did way back then. By the way, she was born in 1916. So she did go back a long way. She was, amidst some of the first psychologists that began to work in the field of mental health. And I think to notice that really we're part of a system, and how we behave and what we say and what we do and what triggers us is about the system. And living alone, we look very different, and we can all be pretty good when we're alone, can't we? We don't
Right.
get triggered by life or by other people, and maybe we can be the person we think we are. But you put us in a system and you add some triggers to that or some pain and hurt. And now we show up differently. And Virginia was well aware of that, began this work. It was just state of the art work back when she was introducing that to all of us.
Yeah, and today it seems so typical that we do talk about families. We do talk about the fact that we're in organizational systems, that our work is relational. And to think that she was one of the first ones to introduce it, how significantly she has influenced all therapeutic work now. And I wonder if part of what's true is she was one of the first women in the field of psychology and therapy, and that unique perspective that she had and that voice around we have to look at the family was part of her legacy, and it came
Mm.
from her own experience in watching her family system.
Mm. I actually don't know the answer to that, Greg, and it could be. I mean, we do know the original psychologists were all men, so that could be. I just don't know, but I do know that she worked in the public a lot to show them what she meant by working in a system, and so she would often invite the public to come to, say, a school auditorium, and she would have someone volunteer to come up on stage with her and they would, talk through some issue they were having, or she would want to show them what happens in the system. And then she would work that out right in front of everybody, not knowing or having an agenda for any of that. And it was so caring and so gentle and so loving. And I mean, she is really contagious when it comes to her presence with people. It is clear that she has a regard and a respect for all human beings. And
Mhm.
I think that's one of the greatest things that comes out of her work was just how comfortable and safe that she created life for anyone who was trying to get well and do life differently. So just a real model of, I believe, our Christian faith as well. What does it mean to love others well? I mean, I think any time I ever looked at anything she had done, it was a portrayal of the faith, of course, I hold, and we all do it, faithful and true, of learning to love people unconditionally as much as
Yeah.
possible as a human being.
Right.
Yeah.
And from a theological perspective, what she lived out was all stories are sacred. And
Hmm.
so when someone is sharing their story or engaging their story, there's a sacredness to that. And she was able to honor that in how she listened and how she showed up and invited them to go deeper into their own story.
Yeah. I can't not talk about Virginia and Maureen without sharing the story that was I first heard about when Mark went for his first session with Maureen Graves. And of course, his story had been all over our city and it had been in the newspapers, and it was very shaming. And there were a lot of people that were very angry with him. And so he was reluctant to show up for yet a woman who was going to be seeing him in this session. And that would be understandable given the reaction of many. But when he went to Maureen and he shared what he had done, Maureen's response was, Mark, you must have been in a lot of pain to do what you did. I think there is no loving presence of someone who starts a relationship that way with someone else. No judgment, no
Mhm.
agenda, no
Yeah.
shaming, no blaming. Just let me step into the presence of what this pain is and let's figure this out together.
One thing I think is significant about the story is how much courage it took for Mark to share it. Because as I understand it from you and Mark, some of the strongest criticism and judgment came from female therapists. And
That's
so
correct.
Mark was a part of a team. The women on the team had a reaction. And
That's
so
right.
here he was going into another therapist office. He had already experienced judgment and criticism, and yet he had the courage. And then Maureen had that beautiful response to his story.
Mhm. One of the things that is true is Mark had already been to 30 days of inpatient treatment.
Mm.
And he was also very broken and remorseful because of the huge consequences that he faced from his acting out. And I think those really led him to that place of being broken and remorseful, which is one of the places we talk about, obviously, here in our center, that prepares a man to really receive the kinds of resources that will help him get well. When you're in that place of broken and remorse, it's an internal motivation to do whatever you have to do to be well. And I believe in that place too is a desire to just be a truth teller and be willing to face the consequences if that means losing more relationships or your family, your children. You're willing to go to that place knowing that this is what it's going to take to get well. So all I would say is this wasn't day two, for Mark, and
Mhm.
maybe it would have looked differently and maybe he would have withheld. I don't know, but certainly I think the consequences is one of the things that led to Mark being broken and remorseful, as we've talked about. I think those stories where there are more consequences, it is much easier to see that place show up in someone than someone who hasn't faced very many
Mhm.
consequences.
Yeah.
So,
One thing that I assume, based upon what I've heard you and Mark talk about, Maureen, and then also, Virginia Satir, is their approach was very invitational. You told the story of inviting somebody up on the stage and to invite them to engage their story. And I think that that's one of the aspects of that model that we seek to live out at Faithful and True, is that it's not demanding somebody tell their story or imposing ourselves on someone else. And what we want to do is invite someone to tell their story and to start bringing out truth from it. And in that truth, even if it was painful truth, to be able to experience freedom.
mhm. I'll share with you a couple of the things that I know were foundational for Virginia's work. And by the way, the name of her therapeutic methods was the Satir Transformational Systemic Therapy and Spirituality. It had all of that as part of the original name. I think eventually they shortened that to be the Satir Transformational Systemic Therapy. So in that are many of the beliefs that we have, obviously, that it's transformational, that if you
Mhm.
do this work, you actually grow in ways that you never experienced before. Your character changes as well as your behavior changes. And that it is systemic because we are looking at that in the context of all of your relationships, not just you yourself and how you're identifying yourself and what you need to change. If there are things other people are seeing or you show up differently publicly than you do privately, that's a problem. We're kind of
Mhm.
working on that being authentic place. So foundationally for Virginia, one of the things that she really wanted to work on with people was growing their confidence. And I would say that's very similar to what we call living in your truth, God's truth about who you are, that you're fearfully and wonderfully made. You're made in my image, he says. And I think confidence is that place where we live in that truth. And we know that both men and women that come to us, whether they're on the betrayal side or the betraying side, that typically is a core belief of not believing in that truth about themselves and even becomes more damaged in the middle of this kind of crisis for them.
Mhm.
But way back when, that was one of the first things that Virginia wanted to work on. She knew how important that was, that people believed about who they were, that they were a good person. And yes, we all do things to medicate that pain, and we don't always like what we're seeing. And we can change that with help and understanding.
And
Another
I
thing
would
that,
even
yeah,
I would add this idea that what we talk about is being grounded in our truth, like you said, the truth of who we are and the truth of who God is. And when we get triggered, one of the ways we can understand a trigger is we get knocked out of our truth.
that's right.
And what we do is we reclaim that truth. And I often say truth is not an accurate depiction of the fact. Sometimes we believe it's like we're in a court of law and we're having to defend ourselves with the correct facts. What we're talking about here with truth, it's the truth that transcends circumstances, and the truth that is universal. That truth is from God, and it's
Mhm.
true for us and true for God.
Right. And the reason that's so hard is because there are some people that say, well, before this happened, I felt that about myself, I felt all of that. I was confident, I was successful, I liked who I was, whatever. But as you're saying, my real test as I ask people about it is, what about before now? Even though you say that, were there not things in your life that rocked you off of that place of truth? And even if you felt that all those younger years of your life, if you were living in that truth today, nothing should rock you off that truth.
Mhm.
And the fact that a crisis today did, to me, seems to indicate there's still some old work to be done on that. I
Right.
didn't really understand that until I got into my own therapy and realizing it wasn't that I was abused or abandoned or whatever. There were some just, everyday sort of things that went on in being a twin in my life.
Mhm.
And those things set me up to do a lot of comparison and a lot of judgment, self-judgment about when I was better, when I was worse. And I never talked to anybody about that, but those days when I did to myself, I certainly rocked myself off that truth. Even generally speaking, I didn't believe that as a whole, but there were these elements that still needed my consideration
Mhm.
and examination. So that's what Virginia did a lot in her system. And again, in the system, we say everywhere you go in that system, you still carry those same beliefs. And I love
Mhm.
that. Another thing that she was very attuned to was wanting people to become active decision makers in their own life. And when you think about it, I think that's oftentimes a big struggle in the coupleships that we work with. It can be on either side of that, but depending on our parenting style or sometimes the beliefs that come from our church or our schools, we're told certain people are better at decision making, or in order to keep you safe, this person has to make decisions for you. And a lot of times people don't have practice making their own decisions and even falling and failing sometimes while they practice that, so that they know eventually as an adult they have practice skills that will lead them to places where they can make hard decisions. That's a really tough one for a lot of our clients. And knowing that that's a part of growing up and being an adult in our life, again, was something Virginia recognized very early on in her work with people.
Right. Well, and as children, what's true is our lives are defined by our circumstances, by other people's decisions, and by other people's reactions. And very much like what you're saying is one of the things that we grow into is recognizing that who I am is not defined by my circumstances, and who I am is not determined by my choices. And so we have to learn to be grounded in that truth, even if our circumstances are challenging. And one of the things that we can know is if someone stays in that place of being overwhelmed or sees themselves as a victim of their circumstances, then they're not grounded in that truth and they can come across as not believing they have choice, not believing they have
Yes.
options, and then feeling very stuck because of this thing that is outside of their control, which can be other people's decisions or just life circumstances.
Right. And it's why one of our greatest sayings around here is you always have choices, right? We're
Yes.
constantly telling everyone that if you feel stuck, if you feel like you're a victim, it's because you've eliminated that belief that you have choices. We all do. And sometimes figuring out why we believe we don't is, again, part of what we can learn about ourselves. And I really like that.
Well, and I also think that sometimes we believe if we have choices, there should be either an obvious or easy choice.
Mhm.
And I often say wise adults always have choices, and sometimes the choices are painful or difficult. There's not an easy option. But even if all of the options are painful and difficult, we still have options in that. And so
Mhm.
sometimes we, like you said, we simply have to be open to looking beyond a kind of a limited view to see a bigger view of what might be possible.
Mhm. And sometimes the choices are not physical choices, but they're mental choices
Hmm.
about what am I going to believe about the fact that right now, everywhere I turn, it's a difficult turn. But what do I believe about that? Do
Hmm.
I do I have a belief? Can I choose to say, maybe it is that God is teaching me something in this difficult time? Which does happen to believe one of our beliefs here and our choices here is to look at crisis or trauma from the lens of it may, in fact, in time, be something that God is leading you to learn about yourself or your life.
Right. Well,
And
this
then,
idea that this circumstance informs me, it doesn't define me.
That's right.
And I think that, the work that we do and this legacy that we have is we remind people, yes, these are difficult circumstances, but they don't define you, they do inform you.
Mhm. Another component of Virginia's work was to become responsible. I love that because we know how helpful it is when we can begin to be an observer of our own life and to start owning the things that we don't do well. And it's very scriptural. As I said, her work was very faith-based. We've all been told to take the plank out of our own eye, to be responsible for the person we are, to not place blame on others for why we are who we are, or why we can't do what we cannot do, but to take responsibility and to take action and to do what we can do. So she was teaching that long, long time ago, and we know it's such an important factor to getting well personally and also to reconciling a relationship, if that's our choice in time, that when we have disagreements, and we will, or arguments or whatever, that ownership and being able to bring ownership to that conversation is going to be essential for it to go well.
Right. I'm so curious about kind of the history of her story because she lived through World War II. And one of the things that we
Yes.
know is so many choices, so many options were kind of taken away during that season. The entire culture was shaped and formed by that war. And so at the end of that, coming out and saying, even with all that we've gone through, even with what we've experienced as a world and as a country, we still take responsibility for our own lives. We still
Mhm.
own whatever is ours. And we know that ownership is foundational to creating safety for ourselves and for others because I can't change what I don't own.
Mhm. And it really eliminates the blame game so many of us can get into. I
Mhm.
mean, I think the more that we take responsibility, the more we become active decision makers, the less we are in that place of wanting to blame someone else. We're just looking at what I want to change for myself, no matter how difficult that situation is. Um, Lastly, one of the other components was to be congruent. This was a big one of Virginia's and certainly of Maureen's too, to work on being an authentic person. In other words, we weren't a different person when we were in with this group of people than we were with this group of people. We weren't a different person in our home with our children than we were when we showed up as an elder at the church, if that was our role.
Mhm.
And I can't tell you how many families live with that kind of hypocrisy in their home. And it's really devastating because I think we all long for that congruency in our life and in other people. And it's one of the things that brings us great safety is when we know someone's going to be the same person, come here or there, or inside or outside of our home. And for the most part, we can trust that. They're not going to show up differently in a certain situation. So, some just really groundbreaking work. There were so many things she taught. I would say in our legacy, we're also emphasizing that our story, perhaps, is what we are being called to share or to be available to others so that we may allow God to use it, however hard it is, for his work and for our redemption as well. And I know, as you said, Greg, Virginia certainly believed in the uniqueness of all of our stories with no judgment and no blame. I guess we would take that a step further in our work to say there is a reason we have a story, and God can use these stories just as He has worked on and used all of our stories of the counselors at our center. We have stories to share, and I think that's oftentimes why people come to us. They know
Mhm.
we've been in the trenches just as they
Right.
are. And although we have education and training, it's being there, having done that, that I think speaks to most of the people that come to us.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the things that I've heard you and Mark attribute to Virginia is this idea that the problem is never the problem. It's
mhm.
a problem, but what we're wanting to get from is like the symptomology to the deeper cause.
That's
And for many of us, we get so focused on the behavioral issues, the things on the surface, and they become a distraction to really going deeper. It's that idea that we treat the symptoms, but not go after what the source of the infection is.
mhm.
And I think that's one of the things that is so powerful about the legacy here at Faithful and True is that when somebody walks in the door, we want to understand what's driving the behavior. There's a reason why we do what we do. And I think in Maureen's statement to Mark, you must have been in a lot of pain to do this. She was saying there's a reason why you do what you do. And
Mhm.
if we can get curious about that reason, that moves us past shame into understanding, and that understanding allows us then to begin to make the changes that we need to make.
Exactly. I love this quote that I heard, and there are many things. Virginia was full of short quotes and things. One of them I love that I always share at the workshop for women is, our commonalities are what bring us together, which is why, like in a women's workshop, our commonalities, well, we've all faced betrayal. But she says our differences are what will help us grow. And I think that's so true. If we all just had everything the same, we wouldn't learn anything from anybody else. But our differences truly do help us to grow. So if we won't run away from our differences and figure we've got too big of a story, or I'm the only one divorced here, or, we haven't had any help and everybody else seems like they have. If we keep looking at our differences, we'll end up finding a way to cope with those and probably pull us out of the arena of getting to know other people. So, but another great statement she made or quote was, life is not what it's supposed to be. It is what it is.
Mm,
The way you cope with it is what makes the difference. And I love that because it's like for the men that come to us for help with their sex addiction, life is what it is. And the truth is, for many, it's full of a lot of pain from early life experiences. How they've been coping with it is using some kind of medication, a substance, or a behavior that has worked to make that feel better. If we cope that way, though, that leads us to a life generally of non-fulfillment, more chaos and disaster. If we learn how to fill our life when those things get hard with healthy solutions, as you always say,
mm,
then we can lead to a much richer, healthier, and self-fulfilling life. And so how we cope makes a huge difference in our pain. And we all do some of that in not a very good way. And so there's always room for us to evaluate that, decide how it's hurting ourselves or our relationships, and what of that we want to change so that we give ourselves more opportunity to live with peace and life.
mhm. That saying, it is what it is. I know when I first heard that, it can feel as if that's very fatalistic. It's
Mhm.
almost, we can hear it through the lens of victim. Well, it is what it is. I can't change it. But the reality is, it's simply acknowledging that you are where you are. I
Mhm.
often say we are the most lost when we are lost and we don't know we're lost. Well,
Mhm.
we can't get found if we don't know where we are. And a lot of times on maps, it starts with the you are here. And I think when it says, it is what it is, it's basically saying acknowledge where you are. You are here. And if you want to get to a different place, you start where you are. And so instead of it being a fatalistic sense of victimhood, it's just let's be truthful about where we are so that then we can get to a new place.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to interpret that, Greg. And I think also it leads us to think about our next right step,
Hmm.
not figuring out how we get to that, the way life is supposed to be, which is our future tripping.
Hmm. Right.
Marriage is supposed to be all glorious, we think, when we get married, and yet it's a lot of hard work. And so if we start with where we are, then maybe in our next right step, it will slowly take us to peace and joy in the life we long for. I love this purpose of satyrs because it is so hopeful. I read that her purpose was to help children, parents, and young people to recover from past events in childhood. She recognizes that we all have pain back there of
Hmm.
some kind, and to improve our relationships within the family and our systems. I think that is so hopeful because we can sometimes, I think, when we're looking and trying to help people in pain, block off too much of their life and their loved ones. And I'm not saying there aren't times when maybe we really need to do that. However, I also know in working with some clients for many, many years who have had very broken relationships, throughout the family that step by step by step, we've been able to bridge those relationships and bring back some lovely, lovely family systems that are working well and they're showing love to one another. I worked with a client for probably 5 years, and one of my greatest Christmas cards was a picture of their whole family, all of the siblings, their married ones, the grandkids, and so forth. And she said, I cannot even believe that we are sitting down at this table together celebrating this holiday as a family.
Yeah.
Prior to that and our work, and I'm not just saying it was me, she did all of the hard work to mend each and every one of these. But it was a lovely reminder that for the most part, we can do that. If people are heard and understood, and we're able to bring our non-coping self and understand the pain of others, it's amazing how we can mend a lot of these broken relationships. And to me, that's a very hopeful and faith-filled purpose in all of our lives, is to learn how to be with others, even when they're difficult people at times. Because you know what? We're all difficult people at
Mhm.
times. None of us have a corner on that, I don't believe.
Yeah. One thing about the system is, for our listeners, there may be some people, and their awareness and what is truth is they're the only one that is trying to change. They're the only one trying to get help. They're the ones getting support. And it can be discouraging if it feels like nobody else in the family system is open. But what's hopeful is, even if no one else in the family system is open, if I change, then I change the way I show up in the system, and the system is changed.
That's
And
right.
so many times it's this idea of, all I can do is show up in my wisest adult way with whatever system I'm in. And even if people are resistant or hostile, I am changing the system because I'm changing the way that I relate to the system. And that brings hope, because if the change is completely dependent on other people buying in, they may not buy in, but I can still be a positive influence for myself and change the system when I show up differently.
Mhm. I wanted to just mention, if anyone listening has more desire to learn about this legacy of Virginia Satir, there are a number of books that have been written by her and by colleagues of hers. And if you go to satirglobal.org, I'm sure you will see them there. There are also some wonderful YouTubes. I've been told, I haven't personally seen them because I have those old CDs you used to plug in and watch. And but they are a Virginia teaching and doing some of that public stuff I was talking about earlier. So I really encourage you to go out and watch the brilliance of this woman and the work she was doing. And by the way, her glasses were those real big ones, just like we're all wearing now, except I'm not yet. But anyway, it's really kind of fun to see how the fashions went way back to the legacy of that. But all I want to say is, by the grace of God, Maureen and Tom got connected to Virginia early on, went to one of her trainings. Maureen was chosen immediately by Virginia with a potential of working in her work, and she invited her to join her in any number of trainings she was doing. So I do have a belief that I know is so true. Maureen was a gifted counselor, and truly beyond any, maybe we all say this about counselors we get close to, but she was angelic in so many ways. She had the ability of loving unconditionally and giving you that regard and respect and nurturing that was beyond anything I'd ever experienced in my life. So having had the privilege to sit at her feet and in her office for hours and hours on end and doing intensives is really, I think, what brought me to the place of working with clients in the way I do, which is only a teeny beginning of what she was able to do with me and with Mark. And so I do know that God brings people into our lives along the way. We didn't know it at the time, but when Mark came home from treatment and we were handed our appointments with the Graves in their place, which was about 20 minutes from our home, we had no idea of the impact that would have on our lives. And I do know today, looking back at what we got through that whole system, Virginia, through Maureen and Tom to us, was actually very God ordained. And I do believe that he had a plan for our life. And I know I know this innocent, naive little girl who didn't ever even use the word sex or anything like that. He had to have a huge sense of humor to think one day I'd be out there using all these words and talking about all this stuff. And yet that's where we were led. And I'm so grateful for that, that our story has led us to this place where now we have a counseling center full of all these folks like you, Greg, and our support staff like you, Randy, um, who are allowing us to give back to other people in need. And like I said, we didn't start this legacy. We just kept following our healing journey day by day that led us into a place of, I think, very much acceptance and by others who also love this invitational place of knowing they are not a bad person. They
Mhm.
are in pain and need support and help in knowing why they chose the things they did to deal with this pain, and the hope that they can make a difference and change that for themselves moving forward. So we have a wonderful legacy. And as I said, it's not the Deb and Mark show. It goes way, way back. And really, I think God must be incredibly proud of using the work of these other folks, bringing it to maybe where we add more faith-based language to ours. And yet we also know there's a lot of pain, even in that journey for most of the folks that come to us. So, I don't know. I love where we are. I love the people we get to work with because they are beautiful, beautiful people.
Well, and what's interesting, and there's also the phrase, I love where we've been.
Yeah.
It is interesting, and I know people early in the journey have difficulty ever believing they could appreciate where they've been. But I
Mhm.
do think we get to a place where we see God's activity, we see God's grace, we see God's presence, we see something beyond just the pain, and we begin to see the transformation and the redemption. And that lens becomes a way that we see our story so that we do get to the place where we're able to say, I love where I've been. It
Mhm.
doesn't justify what I've done. It doesn't excuse what I've done, but it acknowledges if I hadn't been where I was, I can't be where I am now.
Mhm.
And there is something when we get to that place where we can celebrate our present, that it gives us the opportunity to value our past. And I think
Yes.
that that's kind of the one of the invitations that we are able to offer. And again, it's not initially, it's not immediately, but as we continue the journey, we begin to see our own story through a different lens.
Mhm. Well, it's absolutely true. And I think if the term post-traumatic growth had been available to Virginia and Maureen, they would have loved it, loved it, loved it. And we know James 1, 2 through 4 believes that too, that, God has us and he takes us places, and sometimes they are wild, crazy, painful. Not, he doesn't make that happen to us, but he uses it for us to grow up in some shape or form. I would never be the person I am today. I would never have signed up for half the things I've done in my life if it hadn't been for this journey. And I'm really grateful for that, as you say today. It took a lot for me to get engaged, is all I'm saying.
Well, Deb, you you are a glowing reflection of the work of Virginia and Maureen. They would be exceedingly proud of the work you do and the work that you've done.
Mhm.
And they would love to read your books, your new, you know, from your of course Shattered Vows has been around for several years, but your latest book would really make a strong impression on them, and it's such a reflection on the meaningfulness that they have had to your life as well.
Mhm.
So thanks for joining us today. It's been great to have you on the podcast again. Greg, as always, thank you for leading the way. And
Thank you.
we hope that our viewers have enjoyed today's podcast. And we want you to, if you've heard this message and enjoyed the short sharing of our story, of our legacy at Faithful and True, we invite you to visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many, many resources available to you. Over 500 podcasts similar to this, as well as our bookstore with all of the books by Mark and Debbie Laaser. And you'll also find the online information and online registration capabilities to join us for one of our 3-day intensive workshops. We do the men's journey workshop every month for the men, and then about 3 times a year we do the women's journey workshop. And then we also have 2 different couples journey workshops that you can read about and give us a call at our office to get registered. And I think you'll really benefit from any of these great events. Until we join you again, we thank Debbie, we thank Greg, and we look forward to this coming week being a week that is filled with many blessings and with great vision.